So about a month ago, I was wrapping up a video for the Deleuze and Guattari series. We were talking about philosophy being different from communication. Philosophy generates concepts, according to Deleuze and Guattari, whereas communication generates consensus, agreement among people. And thanks to the fact that our phones are definitely spying on us, no sooner had I wrapped up this video than I look at my newsfeed and I see an article with the subtitle, "Why Doesn't Philosophy Progress from Debate to Consensus?" So, coincidence, algorithms, either way, it was kind of eerie. But I read the article and it was really interesting. There were a lot that I didn't agree with in the article. And I thought it would be interesting not just to provide maybe kind of a response to it and maybe share the article with others so they can check it out and formulate their own opinion about it, but also because I thought it was interesting to see that there's a contemporary writer writing in an article that was just written in June of 2021, 30 years after the publication of What is Philosophy. People are still trying to answer that question. So it's kind of making a connection to a more contemporary piece dealing with kind of the same line of thinking that we're exploring with Deleuze and Guattari's work. So I'd like to take a look at this article and give a response to it. So the full title of the article is "Philosophy's Lack of Progress. Why doesn't philosophy progress from debate to consensus?" It's written by Chris Daly, who is a professor of philosophy at the University of Manchester in the United Kingdom. And in his article, Daly argues that the field of philosophy has made virtually no progress over the last 2,500 years since its inception. For a field to be counted as making progress, Daly seems to think two factors are required. The first is that the field in question will have resolved some, if not most, of the problems it investigates, and the second is that it will have a significant degree of agreement on the solution to these problems that will emerge among a substantial number of people who work within that field. So, in other words, a field will have made progress in Daly's view if it has solved some, if not many, of its problems, and it will have reached solutions that a significant number of workers within that field will agree upon. In contrast to philosophy, Daly finds that the field of science has made progress in both of these regards. He points out that there are many scientific problems which have been resolved and that there is general agreement or consensus within the scientific community about these solutions. There is, for example, consensus that the Earth revolves around the sun and not the other way around. There's consensus that the world is spherical rather than flat. Any scientist who claims otherwise would be in the minority of scientists, and their objections to these established and accepted scientific consensus simply would not represent the mainstream views of the scientific community at large. Daly's pointing out that there simply is no philosophical community at large, the same way that there's a scientific community at large. There's no mainstream views in philosophy that most philosophers agree on. There are certainly some that get more attention than others, and that changes over time. But Daly doesn't see anything comparable in philosophy to the kind of consensus that he sees generated by science. These reflections prompt Daly to wonder, why does science produce what he calls reliable results, specifically results in which the scientific community at large can generally agree upon, while philosophy, on the other hand, appears to have provided us with zero reliable results of this nature? A good portion of the article finds Daly considering several possible answers to this question, and each of these he rejects for one reason or another, and we'll look at that later, before finally offering his own answer to the apparent problem of progress in philosophy. And basically what Daly thinks the problem is that philosophers don't rely on the same kind of rigorous methods of inquiry that scientists do rely on. And the scientists use these rigorous methods to achieve what Daly calls reliable results, which philosophy doesn't. In the very last couple paragraphs of the article, Daly offers like kind of a suggestion, maybe a tentative solution to the problem of his own, which is basically that philosophers should try and be more like scientists, that philosophy should try to be more like science, and that, interestingly, one way we could accomplish this, Daly says, is by building a philosophy computer, a computer that can use logic and reasoning to arrive at reliable solutions. And we'll talk about that a little bit. In summary, then, Daly's argument is as follows. 1. A field that is making progress will resolve the problems it investigates, and it will resolve these problems in ways that members of the field can generally agree upon. 2. The field of philosophy has made virtually no progress in either of these regards. 3. The field of science, on the other hand, has made progress in both of these regards. 4. The reason that science has made progress, whereas philosophy is not, is because scientists rely on a much more rigorous method of inquiry, whereas philosophers rely on less rigorous methods of inquiry. Therefore, Daly concludes, philosophers should employ more rigorous methods of inquiry, like the ones that scientists use, in order to produce the kinds of results that science has been able to provide. There is an underlying assumption in Daly's paper that goes unstated in the text itself, but which actually grounds the argument that he's trying to make. The central claim of Daly's argument is that philosophers have not provided us with the kinds of definitive, agreed-upon solutions to its problems that Daly has seen in science. But beneath this claim is another crucial, though unstated, assumption that Daly seems to take for granted. And that is the assumption that philosophy should provide us with these definitive, final answers. And even behind that assumption, there's another assumption, that philosophy can provide us with these kinds of answers. If I accept the underlying assumption that philosophy both can and ought to provide us with definitive answers, answers that resolve problems and which most philosophers can reach an agreement on, and I agreed with the more explicit claims that Daly makes in the paper, then I would have no choice but to agree with Daly's conclusion. I would have to agree with Daly when he says that philosophy should try to be more like science. I do agree with Daly when he says that philosophy has not provided many, possibly any, definitive answers of that sort. But I disagree with the idea that philosophy should, or is even capable of providing with those definitive kinds of answers. The idea that philosophy can and should provide definitive answers, the kinds that science provides us with, follows from the way in which Daly conceives of philosophy. That is to say, what someone thinks philosophy is will necessarily inform what they think it can and ought to do. In philosophical terms, the capacity of philosophy to provide us with definitive answers would be called a modal property of philosophy, something that it's able to do just by virtue of being what it is. Well then, but what is philosophy for Chris Daly? Well, Daly refers to both philosophy and science as fields, which I take to mean a field of inquiry or field of research or something like that, something equivalent. And fields of inquiry, fields of research, typically we think of these as aiming at producing reliable solutions to problems, or we think of these as aiming at contributing to a relevant body of knowledge. Daly's conception of philosophy as a field, just as science is typically understood, lends itself to suggesting that philosophy also, like science, aims at producing definite solutions to problems, final answers to questions, and additional information to some body of knowledge from which people can draw reasonable conclusions about the world, or not just reasonable, but certain conclusions about the world. In other words, a field like science, and on Daly's view, a field like philosophy, is supposed to provide us with answers to increase our knowledge. Now, I think it's fair to say that science is such a field, and I think it's fair to say that human beings have a need, or at least an interest, in acquiring definitive, certain answers, or at least as certain as we're capable of arriving at, concerning the world that we live in. And we have an interest and even a need to increase our knowledge about the world. whether we're trying to improve our lives or improve other people's lives, improve the world we live in, make better decisions, healthier decisions, or maybe we just enjoy the thrill of learning. In any case, the pursuit of knowledge is something intrinsic to human beings. It's just something natural for us to do. And we have a need as well as an interest in doing so. But why should we think of philosophy as being like science in this regard? I mean, have philosophers routinely claimed to offer such answers, such definitive answers? Have philosophers routinely pled philosophy's case as a body of knowledge? Or are these expectations and suppositions that we, the readers, have imposed upon the philosophers? Have philosophers presented themselves as the knowers, or have we, the readers, to borrow a phrase from Jacques Lacan, have we imposed the role of the other supposed to know upon the philosophers that we're reading? I'd like to return to this latter question later. Let's begin with the first question. Have philosophers historically represented themselves as knowers? Well, the first philosopher who comes to mind for me who professed the exact opposite was, of course, Socrates, who famously denounced the idea that he was the smartest man in Athens because, as he said, I know nothing. Socrates said, I don't know anything. That's, the story goes, is that's what made him so wise. But that begs this new question of if what makes Socrates so wise is that he knows nothing, then it seems to imply that wisdom and knowledge are two different things. And philosophy quite literally means the love of wisdom, not the love of knowledge. And I think that says something. But this is just one philosopher's opinion. Maybe Socrates is wrong. Maybe this idea of philosophy as the love of wisdom is simply what philosophy was at an immature stage of its development, at a primitive stage of its development, and by now it should have grown out of it. It should have evolved to the pursuit of knowledge, rather than something vague like the pursuit of wisdom, because after all, one person's wisdom is another person's foolishness. Science has gone through the same kind of evolution, I suppose. Doctors used to perform all kinds of crazy things to keep people from getting sick and cure people once they got sick. Things like bloodletting and things like that they simply don't practice anymore because they're either ineffective or in some cases incredibly dangerous. Maybe philosophy should have gone through the same process, but because of the supposed lack of rigor, philosophy simply didn't mature, hasn't grown up. Now, Daly acknowledges that philosophy asks a lot of questions, but the problem for him is that it doesn't generate any answers to these questions. Where I disagree with Daly is in thinking that that makes philosophy a failure, that it's failed to do its job. But I think that formulating precise questions, formulating the right questions, is absolutely necessary if you want to have worthwhile answers. There's a humorous anecdote about a drunk who's looking for his house keys at night in the street, and he's looking under a street lamp. And a police officer comes over to him and says, "What are you doing?" The drunk says, I lost my house keys, I'm looking for them. So the police officer feels bad for him and starts help looking for his keys. They look for 20 minutes, half an hour. At some point, the police officer says, "Sir, are you sure you dropped your house keys here under this street lamp?" And the drunk says, "Oh no, I didn't drop them under the street lamp. I dropped them in that dark alley over there." So the police officer is pretty pissed off now. And he says, "Well, what the hell are you having me look over here for?" And the drunk says, "Well, there's a light over here." So he's looking for the right thing, his keys, in the wrong place for a reason that is preposterous. I guess the moral of that story is that if you have the wrong mindset or the wrong question framing your inquiry into something, how can you ever come up with the right answer or come up with a productive answer to the problem you're trying to solve? Throughout this article, Daly maintains that on the one hand, that philosophy and science are somehow in the same category, but on the other hand, they couldn't be more different. And this paradox or contradiction, I think, condenses in one line where Daly writes that science had a later start date than philosophy. And that's simply not true. Much of what we today call science at one time would have fallen under the heading of philosophy, and vice versa. A lot of what was once considered philosophy, we now assign to the scientists to deal with. To explain what I mean, let's actually go back to the beginning, to what historians of philosophy generally consider to be the dawn of philosophy. But as I'd like to explain, this moment ultimately represented the dawn of quite a lot of other things besides philosophy, including science. Well, historians of philosophy generally consider philosophy to have begun in the 6th century BCE. The precise moment that it is supposed to have started came with a guy named Thales of Miletus. Miletus was the place, Thales was the guy. What Thales did that was so significant was he made a prediction regarding an astronomical phenomenon. I always can't remember if it was an eclipse that he predicted or a meteor shower, something like of that nature. He successfully predicted that it would occur, when it would occur, and it turned out he was right. What makes this moment so significant is that it led people to wonder, what else can we know? What else can we learn about using our own minds rather than relying on religion and dogma? What can we ourselves, using our own methods, ascertain about the world we live in? That interest in the natural worlds characterized most of philosophy, up until at least the time of Socrates. So most of the philosophers who came before Socrates were interested in nature, in the world. A lot of the work that was being done by philosophers at that time would now be considered astronomy, mathematics, geometry. A lot of what was considered medicine at the time, like Hippocrates, had a lot of really wacky ideas about the human body. Epicurus also had some wacky ideas about the body. A lot of these pre-Socratic philosophers who came before Socrates, were really interested in learning about nature, about bodies, about matter, about the world, including ourselves. One of the things that's always interested me about that is the philosophers known as the atomists, ATOM. This is where we get the word atom from, that we use to describe, the swirlies with the electrons and protons and nucleus and so on and so forth. What's interesting is that the word atom, when it was conceived by these philosophers, was sort of a placeholder. See, they had no way of actually seeing an atom. They didn't have microscopes and things like that. But they inferred that if the world is made up of stuff, there must be some smaller stuff than any of the other stuff that makes up all the stuff. In other words, there must be a thing which nothing is smaller than, something that is like the building block of matter, of reality. And they called this thing an atom. Maybe they hoped someday they would be able to see it, maybe they didn't matter. In either case, if they ever discovered it, that's what they would call it. Well, we thought we discovered it, and that's what we called it. We called what we thought was the smallest particle in existence an atom. But we now know, of course, that an atom is not the smallest particle in existence. We have subatomic particles, particles that are smaller than atoms. yet we kept the word. So it's very interesting. It's one of those issues of proper names where what we're talking about at one time referred to something totally different, and yet we still keep the word. I think it's a little late to change the word now, but this was as far as these guys could go. Like Democritus and Epicurus, this is as far as they could get along the lines of what we would now call science. Socrates changed things because Socrates sort of moved away from this exploration about what the universe is made of and what would have been called natural philosophy about nature, what things are made of. Socrates got more interested in prescriptive philosophy. Philosophy like ethics was a big area of focus for Socrates. What is the good, and how do we get there? How do we do good? How do we be good? This was one of the things that made Socrates such an important philosopher, was that he shifted the focus in philosophy from descriptive inquiries into inquiries into how we can make prescriptive statements. In other words, shifting from statements about how things are to statements about how things ought to be. And that was revolutionary. And over time, what was considered natural philosophy, a lot of that ended up getting assigned to the scientists. As science as it is today recognized, developed. But at the origin of these two fields was this one moment where a human being stood under the stars and made an inference about something that would occur and was correct, and made this discovery. What Thales discovered was not just that this astronomical phenomenon would occur. What he discovered was that he could discover something on his own. And then other people took that and ran with it, and 2,500 years later, we're still here. And to say that that is a failure, to me, is, well, it's premised on asking the wrong question. We go back to the importance of formulating the right question. Daly's asking, why isn't philosophy more like science? Well, I don't think it should be. I think we need philosophy for what it can offer, and we need science for what it can offer. There's certain things that science can give us that philosophy can't, and there's things that philosophy gives us that science can't. And asking why one should be like the other, why philosophy should try to be more like science, to me is like asking why shouldn't an automobile try to be more like an airplane? It's an absurd question. Sometimes you need to take a car, sometimes you need to take an airplane. There's things you can't use an airplane for, there's things you can't use a car for. To suggest that one should try to be like another is preposterous, because they're both good at what they're designed to be doing. There's no need for them to be like the other. They each perform a necessary task. Another thing regarding the relationship between philosophy and science that Daly, I think, makes a mistake in is in how he thinks the relationship between philosophy and science actually is today and has been. So not only does he think that science emerged much later than philosophy, he also doesn't seem to think that philosophy communicates with science at all. I think there's two respects in which philosophy does interact with science and communicate and dialogue with science, and maybe even vice versa. Take, for example, artificial intelligence. A lot of innovations being made in artificial intelligence. There's a lot of excitement, and there's a lot of anxiety. A couple of years ago, there was a pretty widely circulated article about self-driving cars. People arrived at a problem, as far as I know, theoretically, As far as I know, this is not a problem that actually occurred. Hopefully it won't. But people started to wonder if one of the things with these automatic cars is that they're supposed to avoid accidents. Since you're not driving, the car is supposed to swerve out of the way of, something like another car, to avoid getting into an accident. People started wondering, well, what happens if a car, self-driving car, is going down the road and some pedestrians wander into the street when they're not supposed to, and you're not expecting it. And suppose there's two pedestrians coming from one end of the street and another. And it's such a situation where the automatic car has to choose whether to swerve away from one pedestrian and hit the other, or vice versa. And to make it even more disturbing, the article proposed, what if one of the pedestrians is a little old lady, and what if the other pedestrian is a little baby? So the question became, would the self-driving car swerve out of the way of the baby or swerve out of the way of the old lady? And this is the philosophical question, which should it hit? It's a terrible question. It's a terrible situation to imagine. This is, in philosophy, this is what's called a trolley problem. And they're deliberately shocking and disturbing and extreme. But they have real-world implications. The reason people were wondering these things, and were wondering in these extreme scenarios, is because they want to formulate the right answer. When they're sitting down programming these cars, they've got these questions in mind, and that's going to inform how they resolve these problems. They'll resolve the problems using science, but they'll ask the questions using philosophy. The second respect in which philosophy dialogues with science is on the individual level. I can sit back and think over the last 10 years since I read the first book of philosophy I ever picked up, to now where I'm in college studying philosophy in a more structured environment. I can say for sure that the study of these ideas and these works has changed my life, and I wouldn't be able to fit in a single video how many instances of that have happened over the last decade. I'm sure that anyone who's spent any time studying philosophy could say pretty much the same thing. Is that philosophy dialoguing with science? Well, it's a philosopher or a reader of philosophy dialoguing with the spirit that undergirds what science is and what science does, which is inquire after knowledge. Is reflecting on how philosophy has impacted my life or how it's impacted your life, is that not performing some kind of objective inquiry into something real and measurable? Daly mentioned consensus, which is, I guess, what my phone must have heard or seen me looking up when I was working on the Deleuze and Guattari video that I mentioned at the beginning. And Daly writes that progress doesn't require consensus, of course, but the degree to which there is or isn't consensus in a given field can be one indicator of how much progress is achieved. This led me to wonder, would we say the same thing about the field of art or music? Is there consensus in the musical community, in the art community, about what's good art, about what's good music? And on this issue of progress, would we say that the field of art is progressing towards something? Would we say that music is progressing towards something? I guess maybe if you're Hegel, you would say that it is. But a few years ago, I read a series in Scientific American by a writer named John Horgan, who is not a philosopher himself, but he may have written, I think, the best piece on philosophy that I've ever read by someone who's not a philosopher. It's excellent. It was written in late 2017. It's like a 5-part series, and I recommend everyone reads it. It's called What is Philosophy's Point? The subtitle is Hint, It's Not Discovering Truth. So John Horgan clearly takes a different approach than Daly does. And Horgan asks this exact question. He says, he talks about a lot of things about philosophy, not just this progress problem. But that is one thing that he talks about. And he mentions this question of we don't talk this way about art. We don't talk this way about music. Sports is an example that he uses quite heavily in his piece. He says we don't say that sports is progressing towards something. I mean, in the game, there's a goal to win that game, but some teleological, overarching, absolute end point is just, it's not applicable to the field of sports, music, art, and many other fields. And who's to say that philosophy isn't more like these fields, like sports, music, or art, rather than something like science? It's another question that Horgan poses. I recommend this piece to anyone. Definitely check that out. At this point, I would like to offer my conception of philosophy, or maybe not even mine, but one that I think avoids some of the problems that Daly's conception of philosophy seems to fall into. Not only do I think it avoids these problems, but I also think there's good reasons to accept it, which otherwise it wouldn't be worth talking about. When I was reading this paper, I was reminded of something a professor of mine, a philosophy professor of mine, told me. This would have been probably 2 years ago. He told me that one way to look at philosophy is to look at it as one big, long conversation happening across time and space between a bunch of people. So this idea of philosophy as a conversation really stuck in my head and really shaped the way I looked at philosophy. As I was reading this paper, I was reminded of it, I think because I started to think about how many problems seem to emerge from conceiving of philosophy as being akin to science, or as a field which ought to become more like science. I saw some of the problems that I think emerge from that conception. And when I think about philosophy as a conversation, I see a lot of those problems kind of evaporate. Let me say what I mean. First of all, a conversation is not something that progresses towards a goal in most cases. Conversation with a friend or a loved one or a stranger. In fact, that's kind of what makes a conversation fun, is you don't know where it's going to go. Those make for really interesting conversations. If you knew where it was going to go, that would be very boring. There's even many conversations that I think many of us would like to never end. There's some conversations, I mean, haven't you ever had a conversation with someone that like you're reluctant to get up and leave, but maybe you have to because one of you has to be somewhere, but there's this kind of like longing, like I wish this conversation could go on. So if I look at philosophy as a big conversation, like my professor said, and I think about conversations I have day to day with people, there's plenty of conversations that I have that I wish would go on longer. They provide something that I need as a human being, as a social being, as a thinking being, and a feeling being. A big problem with trying to make philosophy more like science is that philosophy already is, in some philosophers' minds, too rational as it is. I look at like the work of philosophers like Martha Nussbaum, who is not the only one to make this argument, but I like her because she's an expert in ancient Greek philosophy. So she's awesome. And she interprets a lot of the Socratic dialogues in a way that focuses on the emotions. Like there's a really good article she wrote about the Credo, where Socrates is in jail waiting to be executed, and his friend Credo is begging him to escape. And Nussbaum is kind of going against the grain in terms of looking at, like, isn't Socrates so noble and so committed to his cause by telling his friend not to be upset? And she's like, why shouldn't he be upset? He's his friend. I mean, loosen up, Socrates. Like, aren't you a human being? And so her and other philosophers, um, especially feminist philosophers, have criticized the overemphasis on reason, and the argument kind of makes sense. It's that human beings, for sure, are reasoning beings, but we're also emotional beings. We're also feeling beings. This is the sort of thing. This is the sort of observation that gives rise to things like care ethics. I've always liked that idea. I've always liked the idea that philosophy should account for all the aspects of being a human being, not just our reasoning capacities, but also our emotional capacities. So there's a case to be made that trying to make philosophy more like science would actually be accentuating a problem that many philosophers are already concerned about as it is. That's another thing to consider. One of the last points I want to make is this idea of reliable results. I don't know why, I just couldn't get that phrase out of my head. Maybe it's the alliteration, but I started to think, I guess, or maybe I started to feel what philosophy, means to me today. And I guess I kind of look at it as a relationship. There's a lot of philosophers that I've spent more time with in the last couple of years than I have with some people. I think in the last year, I probably spent, well, I don't want to, no, I was about to say something on camera that I don't want to say. I've spent the last year hanging out with Karl Marx, and I've spent the last few months hanging out with Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, and that's an investment. And especially Marx. Marx is fun. Marx is fun to hang out with because he's funny. He's a funny writer. He's writing about serious stuff, but most of the stuff I'm reading is him, arguing with other philosophers, which is what I'm interested in, more than his later stuff. And he's fun. He's a fun guy to hang out with. It is a relationship. I've spent probably the same amount of time the previous year reading Lacan, and you enter into a relationship, and a relationship with Lacan is definitely a toxic relationship. It's like one of those, it's a very gray area kind of relationship. It's like not really sure if this is good for me or not kind of thing. But then maybe there's a part of me that likes what's bad for me, and Lacan will certainly bring that out in a person, or brought it out in me, I guess. But it is, you're investing time, you're investing your thought, you're investing some of the most precious aspects of yourself as a human being, your time and your thought and your emotions into spending time with these thinkers. And maybe it's an unusual relationship. I don't think it should replace actual living human relationships, but it's a relationship nonetheless. And I started thinking, would I ever sit with someone I'm in a relationship with and say, I'm not really happy with your progress. I'm really looking for some more reliable results. I'll tell you what would happen if I said that. I would get a well-deserved slap across the face. And I started thinking, like, maybe right or wrong, the way I look at philosophy and the way I relate to philosophy is as a intrinsically human activity. And I really think that philosophy is our birthright as human beings. I think it's something that only we can do, and that therefore we kind of have a responsibility, or I think we're missing out if we don't play with it, if we don't try it out, at least for some period of time in our lives. And for those of us that do invest a significant amount of time of our lives to this kind of work, to this kind of study, the dividends are, you can ask anyone that's been involved in this kind of work, that's been involved in this kind of study for any length of time. The payoff is well worth it's well worth what you put into it. And I'm not sure it's something that I can quantify in a lab, in a test tube, on a piece of graph paper. I don't think that detracts from it, and I don't think that detracts from what science is supposed to do. Like I said, I think that philosophy and science account for different aspects of the human experience and speak to different needs that we have. I'm working on getting a website set up, like a Google Pages or something, but I find that sort of thing very confusing. So I have no idea when that's actually going to be up. But there's a lot of other stuff that I didn't want to talk about in this video because I want to flesh it out in more detail, and the video is already long enough as it is. So at some point I'll post a comment on here whenever I get that site set up, and print and post, you know, some of the notes and maybe a more fleshed out response to this piece. But I hope somebody got something out of it, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what other people thought about this paper. I definitely recommend you read it. One final note I would say is where Daly talks about philosophy as being a bunch of arguments, that it produces no definitive answers. Well, if that's true, and I think he may be right, well, on the second part about it not producing definitive answers, I think he might be right. He doesn't consider one of the benefits of that, which is that when I'm taking issue with a philosopher's arguments, I'm not taking issue with them as a person. Philosophy is one of the best fields to experiment with if you're trying to understand the distinction between disagreeing with an idea and a person. What we're doing is doing exactly what my professor told me to do with philosophy going forward, which is advance the conversation, keep the conversation going, keep that candle burning. That's what I'm doing by responding to this work. It's not to stop the conversation, it's to keep it going, it's to keep the fire from dying. And as philosophers and readers of philosophy, that's our responsibility. Thanks.